A wild mare appeared at the Millionaire'S mansion with her injured foal in her mouth. Alexander ordered the animals removed. He didn't have time for this. But when he saw where she had stopped, on the old grounds of Bellevue Ranch, his blood ran cold. What happened next? No one expected. Before we begin this story of redemption, tell me where you're watching from and hit like if you believe it's never too late for a second chance. Ready? Let's go! Alexander Thompson stared at the financial report without blinking. Numbers that represented evicted families, confiscated lands, shattered lives. To him, they were just figures that fueled his $800 million empire. At 62, he had perfected the art of coldness. Emotions were luxuries men like him couldn't afford. The phone rang. It was Martha, a 70-year-old widow, begging for one more week to gather the mortgage money. Alexander hung up mid-sentence. He instructed his lawyers immediate eviction. There was no room for compassion in his business. Compassion didn't pay the bills, didn't build empires. His philosophy was simple. The world was divided into predators and prey. He had chosen his side decades ago when he learned that trust was synonymous with weakness. Now he lived alone in his fortified mansion in rural Texas, surrounded only by employees paid to obey and security guards trained to keep their distance. He had no immediate family, relationships were business transactions, and friendships belonged to a past he preferred not to revisit. There was something in the past Alexander avoided, like a poorly healed wound. Something about lands that once weren't his, about broken promises and betrayed trust. But that was buried under layers of success and power. The storm approaching that night would force an unforeseen trip. Problems with the hydroelectric plant on one of his remote properties required his immediate presence. Alexander got into his armored SUV, ignoring the lightning that cut across the sky. Business didn't wait for the weather. The torrential rain turned the rural roads into muddy traps. In the darkness, a fallen tree completely blocked the main road. Alexander scoffed in annoyance. He would be forced to use the secondary road that passed by the old Bellevue Ranch facilities, lands he had acquired 15 years ago through methods he preferred not to document. That's when the headlights illuminated the impossible scene. A wild mare, drenched and desperate, stood before the gates of his property. In her mouth, she carefully carried a foal that couldn't have been more than a few days old. The colt was clearly injured, with one of its hind legs at an unnatural angle. The mother looked directly at Alexander through the windshield, as if asking for help. Alexander called security, ordering them to remove the animals immediately. But something about the scene bothered him in an inexplicable way. The mare was wild. That was obvious from her posture, her disheveled coat, the way she moved. Wild horses didn't approach humans. They didn't carry injured foals to mansions. They didn't look people in the eye as if they knew exactly what they were doing. And there was something more disturbing. She had stopped specifically there, at that gate on those lands. The lands that had once been Bellevue Ranch. The place where everything had begun and ended. Alexander got out of the car into the torrential rain. His $3,000 Italian suit was soaked in seconds. He approached the mare slowly. She didn't flinch. The foal was breathing with difficulty, clearly needing urgent veterinary care. Mud clung to his genuine leather shoes. Rain blurred his imported glasses. For the first time in decades, Alexander Thompson made a decision that didn't involve profit. He carried the injured foal in his arms, feeling the fragile weight of life in his hands. The mare followed him, maintaining a respectful but watchful distance. He didn't understand why he was doing this. He just knew he couldn't simply ignore it and leave. The veterinarian arrived an hour later, finding Alexander drenched and covered in mud, holding the foal while the mare stood guard at the entrance of the makeshift stable. Dr. Henry Davies examined the colt carefully, confirming a fracture in its hind leg and severe dehydration. "It's a wild horse, Mr. Thompson. Born free, never domesticated, The mare, too. It's probably between 3 and 5 days old. It will need intensive care for weeks. Alexander tried to find a quick solution. He called wildlife control, local sanctuaries, anywhere that could transfer responsibility. Everyone had the same answer. It was in the middle of a storm, with no safe transport conditions, and the foal was too weak to survive an environmental change. "You'll have to care for him for a few days," the veterinarian said before leaving. "The mother won't leave her foal, and if she decides this place isn't safe, she might take the colt away, even injured. Wild horses choose death in freedom over life in captivity." Alexander watched the mare through his office window. She had positioned herself strategically where she could see both the stable and the property exits. Intelligent, cautious, determined. There was something in her demeanor that both annoyed and fascinated him. Back at work, Alexander found himself distracted. During a crucial video conference about land acquisition in Montana, his eyes wandered to the window. The mare was still there, motionless as a statue. When his partner asked about productivity numbers, Alexander took seconds to respond. On impulse, he cancelled a meeting where he would evict 5 families of small farmers. He said he needed to reevaluate the numbers. His lawyers were confused. Alexander Thompson never reevaluated numbers. Numbers were numbers. Late that afternoon, the veterinarian called with information about the property. "Mr. Thompson, I did some research on the location where the horses were found. This region used to harbor a small herd of wild mustangs. They were protected by the ranch's former owner." The name Bellevue Ranch echoed in Alexander's mind like a death knell. 15 years. It had been 15 years since he last heard that name. Since he had done things he wasn't proud of to acquire those lands. Since he had broken a promise he swore to keep. The former owner was named John Sanders, the veterinarian continued. He dedicated his entire life to the conservation of these wild horses. He said they were the last pure mustangs in the region. He died about 15 years ago, left debts. The family lost everything. Alexander hung up abruptly. His hands trembled imperceptibly. John Sanders, the man who had trusted him. The man he had betrayed when greed spoke louder than friendship. The man who died believing Alexander would honor his word and protect not only the lands, but the wild horses that lived there. Walking toward the stable, Alexander observed the mare and foal for the first time without irritation. There was an ancient intelligence in her eyes, as if she knew exactly where she was and why she had chosen that specific place to seek help. When the veterinarian mentioned where the horses had been born, on the lands of the old Bellevue Ranch, something clicked in Alexander's mind. Bellevue, where everything had begun and ended. Where a friendship had died along with a good man, and where a sacred promise had been broken by greed. Alexander spent the night awake, researching in the dusty archives of his office. He found the folder he had hidden for 15 years, documents from Bellevue Ranch, acquisition contracts, and at the bottom, a yellowed letter he never had the courage to open. The letter was from John Sanders, written 3 days before his death. With trembling hands, Alexander read the words he had avoided for so long. "My friend Alexander, I know my illness is winning. I trust you to care for the mustangs of the valley as you promised. They are the last of their pure lineage. Protect them as I protected them. Our friendship was always worth more than money." John had died believing in Alexander's word. He had died expecting the man he considered a brother to honor the agreement made years before. Alexander would buy the lands at a fair price, maintain the wild horse preserve, and preserve a lifetime's work. Instead, Alexander took advantage of John's medical debts, bought the lands for 1/10 of their real value through questionable legal maneuvers, and immediately converted them into commercial pastures. The wild horses were relocated, a euphemism for expelled from their ancestral lands. The next discovery was even more devastating. In his last months of life, John had tried to make contact dozens of times. Calls Alexander ignored, letters he returned unopened, messages he deleted unread. John died alone, betrayed by the only man he still trusted. Alexander confronted Charles, an old employee who had worked at the original ranch. "Mr. Sanders spent his last months asking about you," Charles said bitterly. "He said you would come back, that you would keep your promise. He died waiting. The wild horses roamed the region for years after you drove them out. Many died. Uri, the mare in the stable, wasn't just an animal seeking help. She was a survivor, possibly descended from the Mustangs John had protected, from the horses Alexander had betrayed along with his best friend. She had brought her injured foal exactly to the place where her ancestors were once protected, as if she instinctively knew that it had been a place of refuge. Alexander locked himself in the marble bathroom of his master suite, and for the first time in 15 years, he cried. Sobs that seemed to tear pieces from his soul, tears that washed away decades of repressed guilt. He had become everything John despised. A man who put profit above life, who broke sacred promises, who betrayed friendships for money. The foal was recovering well under veterinary care, but Alexander faced a much larger crisis. His partners pressed to finalize the sale of other rural properties, including one that would remove 50 more families from their lands. A $200 million deal awaited him in New York City on Monday. But when the veterinarian called to inform him that the foal had a fever and needed constant monitoring, Alexander canceled the trip. For the first time in his life, he put the needs of another being above personal profit. His partners were furious. The contract could be lost. As he watched the mare care for her foal with unconditional devotion, Alexander understood a painful truth. He wasn't saving those wild horses. They were offering him a last chance to honor the memory of John Sanders and reclaim the soul he sold for an empire built on betrayals. In the mansion's attic, Alexander found a wooden box he hadn't opened in decades. Inside, faded photographs showed two smiling young men alongside wild horses. John at 30, robust and full of dreams, stroking a pregnant mare. Alexander at 27, still with kindness in his eyes, holding a camera to document the birth of the preserve's first foal. A specific photograph left him breathless. The same mare from the old photos, with a distinctive crescent moon-shaped mark on her chest. The mare now in his stable had the same mark. It wasn't a coincidence. She was the daughter or granddaughter of that original mare. Charles confirmed his suspicions when Alexander showed him the photos. That mark is hereditary in this lineage. Mr. Sanders used to say it was the mark of resistance. Horses that never surrendered to captivity. The mare in your stable descends directly from the original Mustangs of the preserve. The revelation was like a punch to the gut. Alexander wasn't just caring for random wild horses. He was face to face with the direct descendants of the animals he had promised to protect and had betrayed. His assistant entered the office urgently. "Mr. Thompson, the mining group investors are demanding an answer today. It's $500 million for the right to exploit the valley lands. If you don't sign today, they'll go to another supplier." The valley mentioned was exactly where the mare had been found, where the wild horses still lived. Signing meant condemning the last pure Mustangs in the region to death. Refusing meant losing the greatest financial opportunity of his career. Alexander picked up the gold Mont Blanc pen he had won when he closed his first big deal at John's expense. He looked at the contract that would guarantee his retirement as the richest man in the southern states. Then he looked out the window, where the mare stood tireless guard beside the stable. For 3 hours, the pen remained suspended over the paper. The phone rang incessantly, lawyers pressured, partners threatened to break ties. A lifetime's fortune depended on one signature. Alexander slowly rose, and walked to the stable. The foal was standing, attempting its first hesitant steps. The mare neighed softly, a sound that seemed like gratitude. That's when Alexander realized he was crying again. "I'm not doing this for you," he murmured to the horses. "I'm doing it for the man I betrayed." He returned to the office and, before his perplexed lawyers, tore up the contract. Then he called the investors. "The valley is not for sale. It never will be." The consequences were immediate and brutal. His partners dissolved the partnership, taking 40% of his assets. Distant family members who only appeared for financial interest cut ties. Employees he had known for decades resigned, calling him crazy. In a single afternoon, Alexander lost $300 million and most of his network of contacts. But for the first time in 15 years, he could look at a photograph of John Sanders without feeling sick with guilt. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He would transform the old Bellevue ranchlands into a permanent preserve for wild horses, not as a business, but as redemption. He would start by giving the mare and her foal what had always been theirs by right, a safe home where they could live free. It was too late to ask John for forgiveness, but perhaps there was still time to honor his memory. 3 months later, Alexander had sold 2 smaller properties to finance the creation of the John Sanders Sanctuary. He hired veterinarians specializing in wild horses and biologists to study the best way to reintegrate the Mustangs into their natural habitat. The transformation wasn't just on the lands. Alexander began a methodical work of reparation. He located the 5 families he had evicted in the last year and offered fair compensation without legal caveats. To some, he returned their properties. To others, he provided better homes in locations of their choosing. Mary Johnson, a 73-year-old widow who had lost her family farm due to a loan Alexander had manipulated through predatory interest rates, was at his door one sunny morning. Alexander extended an envelope containing the deed to the original property, now fully paid off, plus a fund of $200 for renovations. Mary didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She just looked into his eyes for a long moment and said, "This doesn't bring my husband back. He died of heartbreak when we lost the land." She took the envelope and left. Alexander stood on the porch, understanding that some wounds never fully heal, but that didn't absolve him of the obligation to try to repair the wrong he had done. The foal, now named Hope, had grown into a young, strong horse. The mare, whom Alexander had named Luna because of the mark on her chest, showed growing trust but maintained her wild dignity intact. She allowed Alexander to approach, but never crossed the line between mutual respect and domestication. Dr. Henry Davies observed the interaction with scientific fascination. "It's extraordinary. Luna clearly recognizes him as a protector, but retains all her wild instincts. It's as if she understands that he's honoring an agreement, not trying to possess her." Alexander established a routine of visiting the sanctuary lands. Every morning, he walked through the pastures where Luna and Hope ran free alongside 3 other rescued Mustangs. He observed without interfering, respecting the wild nature of the animals. It was during one of these walks that he met Peter Sanders, John's nephew, who had lost contact with the family after his uncle's death. Peter worked as a veterinarian in a community clinic, struggling to make ends meet financially. "My uncle talked a lot about you," Peter said, without hostility but with sadness. "He said you were the brother he never had. He died waiting for you to come back to visit." Alexander offered Peter the veterinary directorship of the sanctuary, with a salary 5 times higher than his current one, as well as a house on the property. "I can't undo what I did to your uncle, but I can ensure that his life's work continues through you." Peter accepted, not for money, but because he recognized the sincerity of the offer. "My uncle would say that every man deserves a second chance to do what's right." The sanctuary began receiving visits from rural schools. Alexander, who once avoided unnecessary human contact, now personally guided groups of children, explaining the importance of conserving wild horses. An 8-year-old girl asked why the horses weren't ridden. Alexander knelt to her level and explained, "They were born free. Our responsibility is to protect that freedom, not take it from them." Watching Luna run with hope through the fields that were once a prison and were now a sanctuary, Alexander understood that redemption wasn't about being forgiven. It was about doing things differently with the time he had left. 2 years passed. Alexander, now 64, had completely transformed his philosophy of life. The sanctuary housed 15 wild horses and had become a national reference in conservation. Luna, now a mature mare of approximately 8 years, had given birth to 2 more foals that ran free across the ancestral lands. Hope, at 3 years old, had developed into a magnificent horse that led the younger ones in the herd. Alexander watched with paternal pride the strength and dignity of the animal he had saved when it was still injured and vulnerable. The sanctuary's impact had transcended the boundaries of animal conservation. 20 rural families had been hired to work on the reserve's maintenance, receiving fair wages and professional training. The region was experiencing an economic rebirth based on sustainable tourism. Peter Sanders had become not only the veterinary director, but a genuine friend. On Sunday afternoons, the 2 men sat on the porch of the old caretaker's house, watching the horses and talking about John. Uncle John used to say, "The land has memory." Peter recounted in one of those conversations. He said it always finds a way to heal wounds if we give it a chance. Alexander felt the weight of years in his bones, but also a lightness in his soul that he hadn't experienced since his youth. For the first time in decades, he didn't fear his own mortality. He had built a legacy that would outlive him. An autumn afternoon brought a discovery that would close the circle of redemption. While organizing John's last belongings, which Peter had brought from the family home's attic, Alexander found a diary with entries up to 3 days before his friend's death. The last entry left him speechless. "Alexander will come. I know he will. He might be lost now, but the good boy I knew still exists somewhere inside that businessman. When he comes, the Mustangs will be waiting. They always knew how to wait for those with their heart in the right place." John had died believing not only in the promise, but in the possibility of Alexander's transformation. He had trusted that, even betrayed, the man he loved as a brother would find his way back to his true nature. That night, Alexander walked to the pasture where Luna grazed under the moonlight. The mare raised her head and approached, something she rarely did. For the first time, she allowed him to touch her forehead with the palm of his hand. "Thank you," Alexander murmured. "You brought me back home." A young entrepreneur from the region sought Alexander, offering $50 million for the sanctuary lands. He wanted to build a luxury resort. Alexander received him politely, offered coffee, and explained for 2 hours the importance of conserving wild horses. "Money builds things," he said at the end of the meeting, "but some things, once destroyed, never come back. A friend's trust, a family's dignity, the freedom of a wild horse. I learned that too late." The entrepreneur left confused, but Alexander perceived in his eyes the same blind greed that had once consumed him. Perhaps, with luck, that young man would learn before he turned 60 what truly matters in life. Luna had her 3rd foal that winter. Alexander watched the birth with Peter, 2 men united by the memory of John Sanders and the responsibility to protect what he loved most. On the 15th anniversary of John Sanders' death, Alexander organized a simple ceremony at the sanctuary. Environmental authorities, local families, students and researchers from across the country gathered to inaugurate the John Sanders Research Center, an institute dedicated to the study and conservation of wild horses. Luna, now 9 years old and a respected matriarch of the herd, grazed peacefully with her 3 foals. Hope, A 4-year-old stallion in his prime, had become the natural protector of the younger ones. 18 wild horses ran free across the lands that were once a stage of betrayal and were now a symbol of redemption. Alexander, at 66, ascended the small platform set up near the century-old oak tree where John used to sit to observe the mustangs. His speech was brief and direct. John Sanders dedicated his life to protecting these wild horses. I dedicated years to destroying his work. Today, I don't ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't bring back lost lives or undo betrayals. I only ask that this place be a testament that it's never too late to choose to do things differently. After the ceremony, a 7-year-old girl timidly approached. She was the granddaughter of one of the families Alexander had harmed years earlier. She pointed to Hope, who was running magnificently through the pasture. "Is the horse happy here?" she asked. Alexander knelt to her level. "Do you see how he runs? How he chooses where to graze, how he protects the younger ones? He was born free, grows free, and will die free. It's the kind of happiness you can't buy or give as a gift. It's the happiness of being exactly what you were born to be." The girl nodded solemnly and ran back to her family. Alexander stood watching the scene, 3 generations reunited. Grandparents who had lost their lands, parents who struggled to rebuild, children who would grow up knowing the full story, the betrayal and the redemption. Peter approached with a yellowed envelope. "I found this yesterday at the bottom of the trunk. It's the last letter my uncle wrote, but never sent. It was for you." With trembling hands, Alexander read, "My brother Alexander, if you are reading this, it's because you managed to find your way back. I always knew you would. Mustangers are patient. They wait for decades for those with true hearts. I hope that when we meet again, we can ride together through the eternal fields as we did when we were young and believed friendship was indestructible. I forgive you for everything. Forgive yourself too. With eternal love, John." The sun set over the sanctuary as Alexander walked among the wild horses. Luna approached one last time, leaned her forehead against his chest for a brief moment, and returned to her family. It was a farewell. They both knew that time was coming to an end, but that the legacy would remain. That night, Alexander wrote his will. His entire estate would be designated for the perpetual maintenance of the sanctuary. Peter Sanders would be the eternal guardian of John's work. The wild horses would have permanent legal protection. On the last line he wrote, "I cannot go back and be the friend I should have been, but I can ensure that John Sanders' trust is honored forever. Luna gave me a second chance. Now, it's my turn to pass that on." Outside, Hope neighed into the starry night, a sound that echoed across the fields like a promise of continuity. This story is about regret, about words we didn't say, calls we didn't make, people we left behind while chasing things that don't matter. If you have someone you love but are distant from due to pride, anger, or being too busy, don't wait to need a wild mare to teach you what truly matters. Call, write, show up, because unlike Alexander, you still have time. And if this story reminded you of someone, or if you believe in second chances, share it. We never know who needs to hear this today. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.